For over 38 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll assess the military situation there. I'm Julian Rabka, and this is Build Situation Room. We start with reports of fresh Russian advances east of Pokrovsk, the major city that Russia has been attempting to capture for nearly a year now. Unfortunately, it must be said that Russia is increasingly managing to flank the city from multiple sides. And we're taking a look at a new village called Novopoltavka, which is now under Russian control. And once again, it's Russian footage that shows us not just the conquest itself, not just the flag raising, but also how this place was captured. And now we see before us this small town situated by a lake, or even by 3 lakes. And we can observe that the very first thing being deployed here are FAB-500 bombs. That means these are bombs deployed by the Russian Air Force, which are now falling on this village. We also repeatedly see rocket launchers and other weapons being deployed here, and we will now observe how this is used in conjunction with kamikaze drones against the Ukrainian defenders. Here we see a D-30 artillery piece of the Russian army being deployed, among other things, to carry out attacks here. And this D-30 artillery piece doesn't actually have a very long range. It's effective at around 10 to 15 kilometers. Now we also see the impact, and that already shows what the Ukrainians are lacking even in defense, namely sufficient reconnaissance and enough drones or, well, their own artillery, to fight the Russians here, because theoretically, the Ukrainian drones are more than capable of flying distances exceeding 10 to 50 kilometers. Western-produced 155mm artillery can reach distances up to 40 kilometers. In practice, however, it's the case that the Ukrainians simply don't have enough reconnaissance or enough of their own artillery here, and that's why the Russians are targeting these villages from relatively short range, which they aim to capture. We keep seeing the impacts here, and we also see the Russians monitoring everything. With reconnaissance drones that are directly overhead, here too the Ukrainians are lacking either electronic warfare systems or their own drones capable of shooting down these drones, or at least removing them from the sky entirely. We observe the Russians steadily advancing, closely monitoring the Ukrainians' movements and precisely targeting those areas for attack. And now we see right after, as it were, the forest sections were captured. How the kamikaze drones are flown one after another into the houses held by Ukrainians in Novopoltavka here. And once again, this whole situation ends in a defeat for Ukraine. Here too, we see these are indeed large facilities that had been prepared over months. I'm not sure if it was fully visible, but in certain areas, barbed wires and tank barriers were strategically laid down. And also these trenches, which were not simply dug out, but I hope you can see this here, they are actually secured on both sides. Partly with wood, partly also with metal. And nevertheless, we see that all these installations here become targets of Russian attacks. These are now Ukrainian attempts at defense precisely with individual drones. The Russians are using this hook here, as we can see, to carry out their strategy, to bring these drones down. I believe we've already seen this footage a few days ago. It was included here once again, and now we're seeing the final part of it. So essentially, the end of these attack efforts by the Russian army. Specifically, we see that Novopoltavka is now under Russian control, and once again, in various locations, the Russian tricolor and the flags of the units operating or attacking here are being raised, to clearly show that Novopoltavka has now been captured. We'll examine the situation on the map and see it's becoming critical, not only for Pokrovsk, but also for Konstantinivka, which is very close by. Yesterday, we heard a Ukrainian officer who spoke up very loudly and firmly stated that the situation will continue just as it has been so far. We still haven't found a way, especially to counter the drones. That's why Konstantinivka, seen here on the right, is increasingly at risk. On the left side is Pokrovsk, which once had 45,000 residents, and Mirnohrad with 41,000 inhabitants. And the area we just saw, which was also captured, is roughly this here, moving around here, around Novopoltavka. The orange has already moved beyond it, indicating that the contested area has shifted further north. And we can see that the Russian army clearly has an interest in continuing to push further north here, in order to avoid directly attacking the two cities. Konstantinivka on one side, where I was about 8 weeks ago, and Pokrovsk on the other side, but once again the flanking, once more. You can see, we observe it here relatively well in the south around Pokrovsk and up here in the north. And at the same time, the case is already there, in the south passing by Konstantinivka. And we can see here, not so clearly on the map, it also passes by the city in the north. That means the Russian tactic here, we don't yet know exactly if it will work, but it's exactly the same one we've seen with many major cities before. And if things go really badly for Ukraine, and that's how it looks right now, there's no more support from the US and only very little support from Europe, then it will once again become a matter of survival for Ukraine. Yes, in the worst-case scenario, it could end fatally here with the loss of these cities due to the Russian flanking maneuvers. Specifically, we'll examine why the Russian army is advancing so successfully here. Firstly, it's undoubtedly the fiber-optic drones that have been increasingly deployed in recent days. This footage from the Donetsk region clearly shows Russian fiber-optic drones destroying Ukrainian tanks. And there are just so many drones being deployed, actively in use. Some are already talking about over 1,000 a day, and the Ukrainians simply have nothing to counter them. Even if some drones, as we're seeing here, perhaps get intercepted or crash or miss their target, the tanks still end up with these massive, prominent structures on them. We see it happening time and again. The Russians have plenty of these drones to strike the same tank, hitting it repeatedly one after another. And now we see the fatal explosion of the ammunition in this tank that was just attacked. That means one less. And it's not just one, but in fact, there's a significant number of tanks. That's still the same one we just saw. Now, one after another, the Ukrainian armored vehicles, specifically the main battle tanks, are being directly targeted and attacked by these kamikaze drones. Display no jitter, indicating they're fiber-optic guided and continue flying the attack until the very last moment. And we can also see how the damage continues to increase. We just witnessed the first two impacts here. So far, these are just minor burns or slight scorch marks we're seeing here. But the Russians possess enough resources to continually target the weak spots. Eventually, we reach a point where, as seen from the drone, the armor just can't hold up any longer. Fire hits this T-72 and it's effective. And it will continue to be so, leading to this unit being destroyed. And if we calculate it, as we see here, I think these are 3 tanks that we see being destroyed here, then it is still a lot. Russia is destroying significantly more tanks and armored vehicles than Ukraine could possibly refurbish or receive from the West. Therefore, the Ukrainian situation continues to worsen in the eastern regions of Ukraine, and we can clearly observe from these images here that the Russians are indeed fully capable of effectively targeting and destroying Ukrainian tanks. These are all vehicles positioned at the front line, possibly located 2, 5, or even 10 kilometers away. And all of that is within the range of this Russian reconnaissance and, of course, the Russian kamikaze drones, which can only fly because the Ukrainians are unable to defend their skies. That means the tank on the ground only makes sense nowadays in the era of drones if you can fully establish and maintain complete air superiority in that specific region. Otherwise, a tank, as we just saw, is relatively easy prey here for fiber-optic guided kamikaze drones. And we're looking at another video that shows us how the Russians have caught up by now, how they're no longer lagging or struggling far behind the Ukrainians in terms of drone technology and tactics, but how they are managing to slowly but surely make up for the Ukrainian superiority we've seen over the past months and perhaps even years when it comes to drones. Because the country is fully in war mode, the entire economy is geared toward war production, and it's state-organized to ensure weapons are produced that function effectively, destroying Ukrainian hardware. And that's happening here now. We're seeing Russian attack drones here, specifically small FPV kamikaze drones, targeting the large Ukrainian Baba Yagas, as they're called, or precisely these large drones being deployed. These are hexacopters designed to transport a wide range of items. Sometimes we see bombs attached to them, but we will also see shortly how various materials are attached to them, such as food supplies, ammunition, or water resources for the troops. And we will see time and again, it's always new drones that are targeted and eventually destroyed by the small Russian drone units. So we see various payloads. Here, for example, it looks more like a large bag. That means this could either be ammunition or, well, also food supplies. Next, I believe we're looking at a large bomb hanging directly beneath this Baba Yaga. I think so. Yes, it's quite clear here. So a bomb that actually has a stabilizer in case it's dropped. I hope it's recognizable. So here's the bomb itself, and at the back, you see the typical part for stabilization during the drop. And all these Baba Yagas are being systematically taken out one by one by the Russians and completely destroyed. Here again, we see various bombs that are attached, and I believe in the last video here, we can recognize it. I hope it's clearly visible. Here we can observe this Baba Yaga being launched upwards. This means we're looking at a repeater drone for the Ukrainian army designed to amplify the signal for the FPV kamikaze drones. That's why they fly upwards. And it's extremely bad for the Ukrainians because as soon as this drone is spotted, the Russians immediately know the drone's exact position, which means they also know precisely where the Ukrainian soldiers are operating below. And that, of course, makes it twice as difficult for the Ukrainians because they essentially know that if this booster drone above them is hit, they basically have to change position immediately because the Russians now know the coordinates of their current position. We've observed Russia catching up, even excelling in certain areas, but that doesn't stop them from relying daily on the simplest, even basic civilian technology every single day. They would sacrifice hundreds of their own soldiers to keep pushing forward, but it only works when combined. We're examining new footage that once again reveals how Russian logistics around Pokrovsk are being carried out effectively. Admittedly, these are probably recordings that are a few weeks old because here we don't yet see many leaves on the trees. Nonetheless, this is one of the roads that lead to Pokrovsk, that lead to the front. And we can see here this is a modified Lada that we're in, and we also see on the side these are all destroyed Russian vehicles. This video runs about a minute and we're seeing roughly 50 Russian army vehicles, quote-unquote, which are essentially repurposed civilian vehicles, which Russia has used to advance here. So all this high-tech we just saw, right, all these fiber-optic guided drones, yeah, all the capabilities to also take down Ukrainian bomber drones and booster drones from the skies up above. All of this goes hand in hand with exactly such images here. Namely, it's quite simple here for us. We don't have an armored personnel carrier here, we don't have an MRAP or armored vehicles, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Russian soldiers moving toward the front on a Lada. And looking at the footage, we can see they're surviving this particular ride, but looking at the surrounding footage, we can see what normally happens with these Ladas. During their first, second, or third trip, they're eventually destroyed by a Ukrainian drone. And that, of course, also entails the death or injury of these soldiers. Therefore, it's crucial to always keep in mind all this high-tech that Russia produces, which is, of course, constantly produced in a state-organized manner to advance in Ukraine. All this involves utterly inhumane methods, not just toward Ukraine's army, but especially their own soldiers. And how utterly inhumane the Russian army treats its own soldiers, we also see in the following footage, which vividly and clearly shows us what exactly happens when these soldiers we just witnessed were delivered directly to the front lines. Namely there, Ukraine always calls it a one-way ticket. It truly is a one-way street. The Russians move forward, the Russians are supposed to fight there, they are supposed to either win or die. And a few, seen in these horrific recordings, survive this farce and attempt, severely wounded, to drag themselves back. We've pixelated it here. I'll let it play now. Here we see a Russian soldier slowly retreating from the front line. Only on all fours now because he's severely wounded, and we see here 2 new Russian soldiers who are effectively rotating with him, meaning they're heading towards the front. Now we're seeing exactly how it happens. These are truly shocking images. The 2 Russians glance down briefly at their wounded comrade who's crawling toward them. But that's it. They keep moving forward. This soldier is simply left to die here, and that's just the reality in the Russian army. There's no evacuation, no medical chain, no emergency protocol. It's simply this. Those who don't make it basically fails to meet the objective, dies right at the front, or tries to make it back somehow, or, and this is part of it, of course, he survives until the others come forward, until reinforcements arrive. And if you survive for a few months, which applies to some Russian soldiers, then eventually you can return with your starting bonus of 50,000 to 75,000 euros, and with the 3,000 euros a month, you can eventually return home to your Russian village. And we have new footage that clearly demonstrates how the mechanized Russian attacks typically end in complete disaster. Unlike the earlier propaganda footage, which made it appear as though everything was attacked in a systematic manner and ultimately won. This comes with hundreds of Russian casualties, alongside a significant number of destroyed tanks, armored vehicles, and civilian cars. We're currently examining fresh footage here that documents the recent assault on a smaller village in Ukraine. Again, we spot 2 Russian BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles. Both are fully loaded, with about 10 soldiers each on them. And you'll see in just a moment that we had to heavily pixelate, because in this attack here, neither one of the infantry fighting vehicles nor any of the soldiers survive. But what we're dealing with here is a total loss. As I said, 2 infantry fighting vehicles are approaching, driving into this village. Both are being monitored by the Ukrainians. Now we can see here, I hope it's clear, I'll just mark it quickly. Now we can already see here the first kamikaze drone approaching from up here and attacking this armored vehicle. And this will now become something that continuously repeats itself, ultimately leading to a growing number of casualties here among the Russian soldiers. Here we see the impact, and among the vehicles, it's highly likely that one of the vehicles will soon be abandoned because it's no longer operational and is essentially stranded at an intersection, unable to proceed. Here we see it. The vehicle stopped and will let it start moving shortly. You can now see the drone approaching again from the back right. And here, the absolute explosion. Probably the fuel was hit by this vehicle. That then leads to us naturally having further casualties here, but also to us now having just a single vehicle left, which in this case, and this is quite interesting, at least attempted to evacuate. This means, here we can immediately see that the Russians, which is also why we have to pixelate so much here, that they attempted to transfer the wounded and the dead from this first transport onto the other vehicle. Most of the time, they don't do that, especially in a well, in a footborne attack. Here, however, we see that 2 armored vehicles are involved, and we now have to keep pixelating them again and again because we can see that not only the crew of the first vehicle that has just been hit, but also the crew of the second vehicle, which is trying to evacuate here, are now being killed one after the other. And in the end, we will once again have a loss of 100% here among the Russian attackers. So here we continue to observe the kamikaze drones flying in for their attacks. However, this whole thing once again highlights the challenges faced by the Ukrainian infantry. It's only kamikaze drones at play here, with no Ukrainian soldiers remaining in this village. We're not seeing any combat here, but the Russians can move relatively unthreatened on the ground in yet another Ukrainian village, while of course simultaneously carrying out these massive attacks from above. These very same small kamikaze drones, which in this case here lead to the complete loss of the Russian assault group. From the ground to the air, we'll now see the latest Ukrainian Air Force footage of Russian positions being attacked and destroyed. Once again, it's MiG-29s carrying out the strikes, Soviet-era aircraft of course significantly upgraded in recent years. And we're about to witness here that the Ukrainians are concentrating their fire on 2 structures which have already been partially destroyed. Interesting. Destruction on one side, and here, similarly on the other, this building. And once again, it seems that the Russians, despite everything, stayed in the destroyed buildings and then moved to the other side. And both houses are being very precisely targeted in this particular instance by the ASM-250 bombs originating from France. That means we have once again direct hits on both targets here. We've seen they're relatively far apart, but that's possible because we're dealing with glide bombs, which are GPS guided. Here's another target. 2 bombs are about to hit the same building because that's what they've identified. And we can see it on the stationary camera beforehand, meaning they're hitting, or rather the Ukrainians are hitting, exactly the target they intended to attack, which results in the destruction of that facility, at least in this area that was attacked here. And this once again demonstrates that the Ukrainian Air Force remains active. They can still strike deep behind the front lines. For years, the Russians have claimed to have defeated the Ukrainians here, but no, that's simply not the case. The Ukrainians still have Air Force bases, they still have aircraft. Here we can once again see the aftermath of the hit. And they still have the pilots to carry out multiple attacks daily on Russian units, mainly in Ukraine, and occasionally within Russian territory as well. With consistent and significant support from France, Ukraine is currently receiving approximately 70 or even as many as 80 AASM-250 bombs each month, enabling them to sustain and escalate these airstrikes against Russian military targets. Still, Russia poses a threat with attacks deep behind the front. We have new footage from the Sumy region in northeastern Ukraine, and these images reveal to us an attack, an Iskander-M missile strike targeting a training camp, or more specifically, a military training ground of the Ukrainian army in Shostka. And there's currently a lot of outrage about it, even among Ukrainian bloggers, because people are asking, how could this happen? How is it possible that in the 4th year of this ongoing war, we are still at positions that are clearly being monitored by Russian drones, situated just 50 kilometers from the Kursk and Bryansk border, where we currently have around 100 soldiers who are actively training together, clearly marching in unison, and who are now essentially undergoing comprehensive military training exercises here on this facility. The Russians have monitored everything closely, staying present. We observe their movements, and soon the Iskander will precisely target this location, where the Ukrainians are presumably positioned under the trees right now, and how this Iskander is launched and impacts, resulting in casualties and injuries here on the ground. We are currently witnessing the impact and have received updates from Ukrainian bloggers closely linked to the military, reporting 6 fatalities and 20 injuries resulting from this attack. But as I said, there's quite a lot of criticism about this, because the bloggers are saying, how can this be? How can our army still dare, one might almost say, to carry out troop concentrations at well-known training grounds, which can then be easily targeted and effectively decimated by Russian forces? Footage, as mentioned earlier, is coming from Sumy, located in northeast Ukraine. Let's take a closer look at the situation based on the Ukrainian reports and their claims that the Russians are amassing additional troops beyond the border, both in Sumy and Kharkiv, to prepare for a large-scale new assault on these regions. And we can already see in both regions that parts of them are currently under occupation. In Sumy, a relatively small area here at the top, that's maybe around 30 square kilometers. In Kharkiv, it's significantly more. We experienced the advance from last year here near Vovchansk. We saw the advance at Liptsy heading toward Kharkiv, where 1.5 million still live. But we also have the situation here in the east of Kharkiv, where around Kupiansk there are occupied territories and the Russians aim to push forward, at least. And now we have an entirely new situation, namely that the Russian army is allegedly intensifying its efforts here, pushing along the borders in areas where Ukrainian soldiers are still holding their own territory up to the border, essentially. That a new attack is currently being prepared there. And we also have footage from the Russian side that proves they are at least conducting preparatory operations here, specifically against Ukrainian. Logistics and infrastructure in these relatively untouched locations so far. Here we see one of these small villages, where the level of destruction is far less severe compared to Donetsk. These are all areas that, so far, have barely been affected by combat activity. Yes, here a couple of roofs are already destroyed, if you will, but much still appears fully intact. Here, the Russians use fibre-optic drones as they produce them in large numbers. They can deploy these fibre-optic drones simultaneously the south, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and here in Kharkiv every single day, which tells us a lot about Russia's war efforts to continue this conflict and not, as the Kremlin claims, to seek some sort of peaceful solution here. And we keep seeing this logistics repeatedly targeted by Russian drones right here. We see the crew attempting to reach safety at the very last moment here, but we also keep witnessing new drones flying in on them. Some are civilian vehicles of the Ukrainian army partially sheltered in the forests. At times we see it around the villages where the Ukrainians along the border have taken positions that more and more of these vehicles are called in. Here as well, we just saw it on the left side. The residential building, likely abandoned by civilians, is very close to the border with Russia and is now being used by Ukrainian soldiers. Here we continuously observe how the Russians operate in nearly intact villages, where everything remains unchanged, but no civilians are left. But now it's mostly soldiers there, and you can see these vehicles are being attacked one after another. As mentioned, this is happening near the border with Russia, and we can see that Russia is preparing the groundwork here, at least laying the foundation so that, theoretically, after restricting the logistics and movement capabilities of the Ukrainians for weeks or perhaps months across the border, that they could then also, if necessary, proceed with their own soldiers. Unconfirmed Ukrainian reports suggest they might deploy troops here in the northeast of Ukraine, then fall back again. First, we want to take a look at a video from the Black Sea, which was recorded west of the Russian-occupied Crimean Peninsula. And this video highlights yet another Ukrainian innovation, showcasing the seamless coordination of unmanned sea drones, such as the Magura-type waterborne ones, alongside flying drones. Either fixed-wing, as we'll see in a moment, or FPV kamikaze drones. And with this, Ukraine essentially manages to have floating motherships for these drones and then carry out attacks relatively far into the Russian-occupied part of the Black Sea. We're about to see attacks on a Russian drilling platform, which of course has also been militarized by now. Here we are witnessing the launch of a drone from one of these floating Magura drone platforms. We'll get a better look in a moment. That was an FPV drone. Here's another one in action, but I think we'll soon see, if I'm not mistaken, the launch of a fixed-wing aircraft. Here we can see it. Here it is. A fixed-wing aircraft is being launched from a drone. So we've got a mothership, a carrier that launches these drones. Those were just training clips. Now we're seeing live footage from Ukraine's SBU actively operating in this specific region. And at this very moment, we're witnessing one of these drones launched from the middle of the sea, attacking and targeting a Neva Sea surveillance radar. Here we can see it positioned on this drilling platform. The Ukrainians aim to show they can get quite close to these platforms with their maritime drones. However, these maritime drones likely cause relatively little damage when they manage to reach their target, because as we can see, these are all very complex structures. What we are seeing here now is a view from another drone or boat, monitoring an explosion caused by a Ukrainian boat or larger drone. Specifics about that are uncertain. That means the Ukrainians are still trying to resist in the Black Sea, attempting at least to prevent the Russians from being in a position where they could again entertain the idea of an amphibious landing in the Odessa region. However, the current focus of the fighting is in the southeast of the country, and we've just seen it. New Russian invasion plans, most likely at least targeting the northeast of Ukraine.